Hey guys, I am going to go over some of the basics of modernism, specifically seen in Williams and Brooks today. So things get weird. So we've gone from, hey, this is how your life is, to what even is reality, and also society is broken. So modernism is getting very chaotic, but in a hopefully mostly good way. So modernism is the literary response to a world that suddenly no longer makes sense. So generally, modernism is said to have begun around 1914 to 1918. There are early hints of it with writers like Joseph Conrad and Henry James, but the war really accelerates everything. Lecture, you'll see how the Industrial Revolution really influenced that, where human progress not didn't save humanity so much as it nearly destroyed it, which really produced a cultural shock that changed art and literature, music, philosophy, psychology. Basically, all of the ologies were impacted by this. So let's talk about the world before World War One. Now, before World War One, people largely believed the world was improving. Science was advancing, industry was expanding, European empires were that controlled huge parts of the globe. And so many people believe Western civilization represented the peak of human development. And then World War happened and said, actually, we just invented better ways to kill each other. So the worldview that supported Victorian literature, one of nationalism and belief in human progress, it suddenly collapsed. So let's talk about the World War One and its impact on the on literature. So at the beginning of the war, people were really excited. Many people believed that they would march gloriously into battle, quickly, and be home by Christmas. Instead, what they got was a war that killed 9 million British soldiers alone, not including civilians, um, and that lasted 4 years. Um, there was this realization that I don't know if you guys, anybody but the history buffs will know this, but the war started because there was an assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Because of the alliances created by the nations, the whole world got dragged into a war that was essentially pointless, right? They're not fighting for justice. They're fighting because some archduke, some like royal dude, got assassinated, right? And so part of or one of the biggest changes of this war structure was trench warfare. Now, imagine this. So, Louisiana is full of not necessarily trenches, but we have really big ditches. So imagine living in a muddy ditch for weeks or even months. If your best friend was fighting in the trench beside you and they were shot and killed, there was nowhere to move their body, so you have to watch them decay. Not only that, but your feet are constantly wet from the rain because there's not really good drainage in a trench or a ditch, right? And then there are the sounds of artillery explosions and mustard gas. So basically, people started suffering from shell shock, which is what we now call PTSD. Psychologists describing it as the minds of the dead have ravished. And after this, culture was never the same. So it's from this kind of break in the psyche of so many people that we get the modern condition. So in the modern condition, there's no clear meaning or purpose. There's an isolation between individuals. Language fails to connect people and reality becomes subjective. Essentially, people no longer trusted the people in charge, right? They don't trust the governments because they dragged them into a pointless war. And so people who lived through this, who Gertrude Stein refers to as the lost generation, they are referred to as hollow men, right? So they're hollow, they're lacking identity, they lack purpose. A lot of times, especially if you read the poems of T.S. Eliot, you'll see the metaphor for these people or for reality of this time as a desert with no water, no life, no meaning. And everything we read today is in response to this condition. So, because we know, or the modernists no longer trusted the people in charge, there was what's called a crisis of representation. The idea that art no longer reflects reality clearly. Because who is to say what reality looks like, right? We have a bunch of people who are suffering from PTSD, and they no longer trust anybody to tell them what reality is. So there's no direct connection between the world and the artist's interpretation. If you've ever seen a Picasso painting, you'll know what I'm talking about. And so I want you guys to take a second and Google Picasso's Weeping Woman, right? What you're going to see there is not necessarily an image of what a weeping woman looks like to our eyes, but it may show a deeper psychological understanding of the woman and her, like what she's kind of going through, right? So we don't see an accurate representation in that way, but it is still accurate. Picasso says that art is a lie that tells the truth. And so we see that in here, right? So remember, modernism is a response to a world that no longer makes sense. So why should art make sense, right? Art meaning poetry and music and paintings and stuff as well. So I have here a picture of Marcel Duchamp's A Nude Descending a Staircase. Now, I don't know about you, and I mean, it's been a minute since my glasses were checked, but that painting doesn't really look like a nude descending a staircase. Maybe if you kind of squint at it, you get kind of a person shape and some stairs. But that is not what we see in reality. So what we're seeing now is art starting to represent philosophical ideas with no direct connection between reality and representation. So this sets up a sort of distortion of rhythm and a breaking of language that we see in the poems for today. So let's talk about William Carlos Williams. Williams believed that poetry should focus on ordinary life instead of referencing classic mythology or talking to the winds like you see in some of the romantic poets. Instead, what we see are everyday objects being focused on, everyday language, American language. His motto became no ideas but in things, or things, and he represents American branch of modernism. It's not very elitist and is more grounded in everyday life. Now, Williams was a doctor, so he used to write poetry on his prescription pad when walking to and from appointments. So it's super interesting there. Um, so you're going to see poetry that's grounded in reality. So with that, let's look at one of his poems. This is the poem, This Is Just to Say. This is what's called a found poem, which is or it just words that sound kind of poetic, right? Yeah, it reads like a note on the fridge. So let me read the poem. So, I've eaten the plums that were in the icebox in which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. Now, this poem looks, simple, but it does create an interesting tension. The speaker is saying he's sorry, but then also says they were delicious, so sweet and so cold, which sounds suspiciously like he would do it again. So this poem reflects everyday life, informal language, and emotional ambiguity. We don't see a whole lot of symbolism here like we did with like the poems of Dutt, right? This also hints at a failure of communication. Is the speaker bragging? Is he apologizing? We can't really tell. Now, this poem used what's called an apostrophe. An apostrophe is an address to a speaker or to someone who's not present. So this is making it clear that this confession of having to eat plums is directed at someone who is most likely saving the fruit for breakfast. Now, what's interesting here is that oftentimes apostrophes were used in poetry before modernism to address an inanimate object like the stars or the ocean, something bigger than oneself, or an abstract idea like love or fate, or a being like a god or a muse. But in the modernist context, they're no longer looking to big things for answers, right? They're no longer trusting in the idea of fate. They're no longer trusting in necessarily a God anymore. And so this is addressed to just an everyday person. So it's very much grounded in reality. Now let's talk about Gwendolyn Brooks. So Gwendolyn Brooks is technically outside of the modernist timeline of the period between the world wars, but her poem is very modernist in method and use, right? She does focus on urban youth and marginalized voices, and was the first Black Pulitzer Prize winner, which is an incredible feat. I am going to link a video to her saying it so you can hear how it's supposed to be read. I will try my best, but I won't do it very good justice. But it's the pool players at the Golden Shovel. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon. Now, this poem, it looks kind of smooth, it sounds kind of smooth, but the rhythm is slightly off, which creates a tension, right? Almost every line of this poem is enjambed, right? Meaning that it continues, right? That we have we real cool, and then a period here, and then the enjambment of we left school, and it continues on the second line. And so this poem, it sounds almost like a jazz beat, right? It uses what's called syncopation, which is a musical technique that disrupts the rhythmic pulse by accenting weak or off beats rather than strong beats, right? So it sounds almost like a jazz song. We also have a repetition of we. Who is we? Does anyone have an individual voice? So it's talking about we, but he never really says who is we. Is it the seven players at the Golden Shovel, or is it somebody watching the seven players at the Golden Shovel? Does anyone have an individual voice? And so in this poem, we see themes of youth and morality, right? So we've got some tension between the youth who are leaving school and lurking late and doing all of these rule breaking type things, these rebels. So it seems like it's praising the rebels, but at the end, we have we die soon, right? So the poem is essentially implying that the price of living fast is to die young. Now, it's not necessarily, I don't know, condemning this life. I mean, live fast, die young is still a phrase around for a reason. But yeah, this ambiguity shows it is acknowledged here, right? Now, I want to talk about the lines here, the seven players at the Golden Shovel, right? There's an interesting bit of symbolism here because we have the word golden, which is fancy, expensive, but we have the word shovel, right? Shovels are ordinary. It's still something that people use to dig holes and ditches and graves. It may be glamorous, but it's still a shovel. So in this way, the poem subtitle may suggest that the reader shouldn't take the speakers at their word, that they shouldn't entirely fall for the surface level glamour or pleasure of the rebellious lifestyle, because the rebellion, for all its fun, is still the shovel digging their own graves, the nail in their coffins. And so I want you, so this poem very much has a lot of modernness. We've got fragmentation, right? A breaking up. We've got the rhythm being disrupted and identity being unstable. So Brooks is showing controlled fragmentation. And modernism is all about that fragmentation.